The late afternoon sun blazed down on the frontier town of Silver Bend, baking the dirt street into cracked clay. A dust devil spun lazily past the saloon before breaking apart near the weathered train depot. Townsfolk gathered along the wooden platform, their Sunday best clothes dulled by grit carried on the wind. Among them stood Caleb Holt, tall and broad-shouldered, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, his Stetson pulled low against the glare. His face bore the quiet toughness of a man who had worked the land since boyhood. Square jaw, sun-browned skin, and eyes the color of iron nails. He wasn't dressed to impress, just neat enough to mark the occasion. In his hand, he held a folded letter, edges worn from too much handling. The mail-order agency's reply, a promise that a bride was on her way to him. He hadn't written flowery words or offered romance. He had simply said he had land, a roof, steady work, and coin enough to provide. All he expected in return was someone plain, steady, and capable. Caleb's heart was a fortress. Years back, a raid had left his parents dead and his ranch scarred. Since then, he had lived alone, pouring his grief into fences, cattle, and survival. Marriage wasn't about love for him. It was about necessity. He told himself as much every time he unfolded that letter. The depot clock struck 4, and a whistle echoed from beyond the ridge. Heads turned. Mothers tightened grips on children's hands. The rails began to hum, and a plume of black smoke curled against the wide blue sky. Caleb's fingers tightened around the paper. The train thundered in, steel wheels screeching as sparks spat from the brakes. Dust and steam swallowed the platform. The air grew thick with heat, iron, and smoke. For a moment, no one could see a thing. Caleb held his ground, boot heels planted, chest tight. He told himself it didn't matter who stepped off that train. Plain, plain, plain. That was all he had asked for. That was all he needed. Then the steam cleared. A figure emerged from the doorway of the passenger car. At first, only the outline of a bonnet and a traveling dress. Then she stepped down onto the platform, and Caleb's world shifted. She was not plain. Not at all. Seraphina Vale. Her name was stitched onto the trunk a porter carried behind her, though Caleb barely noticed the letters. His eyes were locked on the woman herself. She moved with a quiet grace that seemed out of place in the dust-blown town. Her dress was simple but fitted, the soft blue fabric catching the dying light. A stray lock of chestnut hair escaped her bonnet, curling against her cheek. Her skin was pale from eastern air, her lips pressed tight as though bracing against something unseen. And then there were her eyes, emerald green, deep and watchful, carrying both beauty and sorrow in equal measure. Caleb's chest tightened. He had expected a tired woman, maybe older than himself, worn from years of hardship, plain-faced and practical. Instead, he found himself staring at someone who seemed to carry the grace of another world. But there was weight in the way she looked around, cautious, as though expecting danger even here. Her gaze fell on Caleb, and for a moment neither of them moved, their eyes locked. His gray hardened by years of loss. Hers a green, alive with secrets she wasn't ready to share. Distrust, hope, and sorrow clashed silently in that meeting of gazes. A porter set her trunk at Caleb's boots. The man tipped his hat and moved on. Seraphina stood still, hands clasped together, trying to steady herself. Caleb cleared his throat. His voice came low, gravelly. "Miss Vale?" Her lips parted, and though her voice trembled, it held dignity. "Yes, you must be—" "Mr. Holt," Caleb gave a stiff nod. "Caleb," a silence stretched. Around them, townsfolk whispered, curious eyes stealing glances at the rancher who had sent for a bride and the unexpected beauty who had arrived. Caleb reached for her trunk. His calloused hand brushed the handle, then steadied it with ease. "I'll take this." Seraphina hesitated before letting go, her fingers grazing his for the briefest instant. Caleb swallowed. He had told himself 100 times that this was no more than a practical arrangement. That beauty was a distraction a man couldn't afford in the West. But as he felt the weight of her gaze on him, something shifted in the silence of his chest. For years, he had lived with only wind, dust, and ghosts for company. Now, standing before him was a woman who was anything but plain, and who carried with her the promise of change, for better or worse. Caleb tightened his grip on the trunk and said the only words that came to him, "Let's get you home." Seraphina lowered her gaze, her lips tightening as if she carried more than she dared speak. She followed him off the platform, her steps soft but steady, into a life neither of them had truly expected. And though Caleb did not yet know it, the moment the train's steam cleared was the moment his carefully built fortress began to crack. The wagon wheels creaked over rutted earth as the sun bled into the western horizon. Shadows stretched long across the prairie, swallowing the last colors of day. Caleb Holt sat tall at the reins, his jaw set in its usual line of silence. Beside him, Seraphina Vale sat rigid, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her emerald eyes cast toward the distance. The ranch lay another hour's ride beyond Silver Bend, but already the weight of unspoken words pressed down heavier than the twilight air. Caleb wasn't a man fond of chatter, yet he found himself restless in the quiet. Every so often he stole glances at her, searching for clues. She was beautiful, yes, but beauty wasn't what had unsettled him. It was the sorrow stitched into her every gesture, the way her eyes flinched when the wind caught suddenly, the way her fingers twitched like they were used to clutching something, or someone no longer there. He cleared his throat. "You traveled far?" Seraphina's gaze shifted, her voice soft, careful. "From St. Louis." The train felt endless, though perhaps that is the nature of all journeys west. Caleb gave a low grunt. "Hard ride for a lady." "I've known harder," she replied quickly, then lowered her eyes as though she regretted saying it. Caleb's grip on the reins tightened. He didn't press her. A man who had buried his own ghost knew better than to pry into someone else's. Still, her words lingered. "Harder? What could be harder than leaving everything behind to marry a stranger in a wild land?" The prairie wind lifted her bonnet ties, revealing more of her face. The fading light caught her cheekbones, delicate yet proud. Caleb forced himself to look away, focusing instead on the endless sea of grass rolling toward the mountains. He couldn't afford to let beauty muddle his sense. A wife was meant to share work, not haunt a man's thoughts. At last, the silhouette of Holt Ranch appeared. A squat cabin of hewn logs, fences stretching outward, cattle penned in the distance. Smoke curled from the chimney where his hired hand, old Josiah, had likely lit the stove. "This is it," Caleb said, slowing the wagon. Seraphina studied the homestead without a word. Something in her eyes flickered. Not disappointment, but perhaps fear. She clutched her skirt tighter. Josiah, wiry and gray-bearded, shuffled from the porch, tipping his hat. "Well now, so the rumors were true. You went and fetched yourself a bride." Seraphina flushed faintly at the blunt words. Caleb shot Josiah a warning glance, then helped her down from the wagon. His hands brushed her waist for the briefest moment, steadying her as her boots touched dirt. She was light in his arms, fragile almost, though there was a strength in the way she straightened her back immediately, as if refusing to be seen as weak. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and pine soap. The main room was plain but solid, a hearth, a rough-hewn table, shelves lined with jars and tools. Caleb had scrubbed it down that morning, though he doubted she noticed the effort. "You'll have the loft for now," he said, gesturing to the staircase. Until you're settled." Her eyes lingered on him for a moment before she nodded. "Thank you." He busied himself stoking the fire, needing something to do with his hands. Behind him, he could hear her soft steps across the floorboards, the rustle of her dress as she moved cautiously, like someone learning a new language. Over supper, beans and cornbread, silence filled the table thicker than smoke. Caleb ate with his usual focus, but Seraphina only picked at her food, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. At last, he spoke. "You don't have to be afraid here. Whatever you left behind, it won't follow you to Silver Bend." Her fork froze halfway to her lips. Slowly, she lowered it, her emerald eyes locking onto his. For a heartbeat, her gaze was raw, unguarded, and Caleb saw something that made his stomach clench. Fear. Not the ordinary fear of a new life or a strange husband. This was deeper, sharper, as if something or someone hunted her memory. Her voice trembled when she answered. "You don't know what follows me, Mr. Holt." The words hung heavy between them. Caleb didn't push further, but inside unease stirred. He knew enough of the West to recognize danger when it crouched in silence. Later, when Seraphina climbed to the loft and he lay on his cot below, Caleb stared at the rafters long into the night. Her beauty had been unexpected, but it was her sorrow, her secret, that kept him awake. Whatever she carried west with her, it was no small burden, and though he told himself he had married only for practicality, Caleb felt a truth creeping in, her story, her fears, were already binding themselves to his own. The prairie outside howled with coyotes. Inside, in the stillness of that small cabin, Caleb Holt realized the woman who was supposed to bring him silence had instead brought him questions that might change his life forever. The next morning broke with a restless wind. Clouds bruised the sky, heavy with the promise of rain. Caleb rose early, as he always did, splitting kindling by the shed before hitching his mare for the day's ride. Yet his thoughts were not on the chores. They circled again and again, back to the woman now moving quietly through his cabin. Seraphina had woken before dawn, her hair pinned neatly despite the long journey, her hands busy sweeping floors that already gleamed from Caleb's careful scrubbing the day before. She carried herself with quiet determination, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion, the kind that didn't come from travel alone. Caleb paused in the doorway, axe in hand, watching her for a moment. He was struck again by how unlike his expectations she was. He had asked for a plain bride, a woman to share work and silence. What he had received was a mystery wrapped in beauty, and mystery was something Caleb Holt had no use for. "You don't need to fuss," he said finally. "House is fine." Seraphina straightened, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Keeping busy helps," she murmured. There was something in her voice, a carefulness, as if each word was weighed before it left her lips. Caleb wanted to ask what haunted her, what shadows pressed so tightly against her back. But years of hard living had taught him restraint. Some truths, if forced too soon, cut worse than silence. By noon, the storm broke. Sheets of rain battered the prairie, thunder rolling across the open land like the pounding of war drums. Caleb secured the shutters while Seraphina fed the fire, the two of them moving in unspoken rhythm. Yet as the wind howled outside, the small cabin seemed too small to contain the silence between them. At last, Seraphina spoke. "You live far from town." "Too many people there," Caleb replied simply. She gave a faint, wistful smile. Too many eyes, the words made Caleb turn. She wasn't looking at him, but into the fire, her face bathed in its glow. For the first time, he noticed the faintest scar just below her jawline. Thin, white, almost hidden by the delicate curve of her neck. Not the mark of accident, the mark of violence. Before he could speak, a sharp rap echoed at the door. Caleb stiffened. In weather like this, no one came calling unless it was urgent. He unlatched the door to find Sheriff Asa Briggs, broad-shouldered and rain-soaked, his mustache dripping. His eyes flicked quickly past Caleb into the cabin, landing on Seraphina. "Caleb," the sheriff said gruffly. "Heard word from the telegraph office this morning. St. Louis sent through a notice. There's a man hunting a woman. Tall fella, black coat. Calls himself Donovan Vale. Claims she's his wife. Says she ran off." The name dropped like a stone in the room. Seraphina went pale, her knuckles tightening around the edge of the table. Caleb's gaze darted to her, then back to the sheriff. "She yours?" Asa asked, voice low. Caleb's jaw worked. He looked again at Seraphina, her emerald eyes wide, terrified, pleading. The truth screamed in that silence. She hadn't told him everything. "She's my wife," Caleb said at last, his voice flat as iron. "And no one's taking her from here?" The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. "All right, Holt. Just know, if that man comes looking, he won't be polite about it." When the door shut and the sheriff's horse disappeared into the storm, the cabin seemed to breathe differently. Caleb turned slowly, his eyes locking on Seraphina. "Vale," he said quietly. "That's your name?" Her lips trembled. "Donovan is my husband. By law, perhaps. But not by God, not by choice." She turned away, voice breaking. "He married me for my father's fortune. When it was gone, he made me his possession, his prisoner. I fled before he killed me. Coming here at you was my only chance." Caleb stood silent, the storm rattling the shutters around them. He had expected a wife to share his solitude. Instead, he had taken in a hunted woman whose past was thundering toward them like the storm outside. For the first time in years, Caleb felt something old stir in him. Not fear, not anger, but the raw instinct to protect. His bride was no plain woman. She was a fugitive of a dangerous man, and whether he liked it or not, Caleb Holt was already standing between her and the storm. The storm eased by dawn, leaving the prairie washed clean, glittering with dew. But in Caleb Holt's cabin, the air was thick with unease. Seraphina had spoken little after revealing her past. She sat at the table with her hands folded tight, eyes distant, as though listening for hoofbeats that had not yet come. Caleb busied himself outside, repairing a loose rail in the corral. But his mind was far from the work. Each strike of his hammer echoed with the sheriff's warning. A man will come. A man who won't be polite. By midday, Seraphina appeared in the doorway, shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "You don't have to keep me," she said softly. "If I leave now, maybe Donovan won't trouble you." Caleb looked up sharply. "You think running will stop him? Men like that don't quit. He'll follow you until you've got nowhere left to run." Her eyes glistened, but she held his gaze. "And what about you, Caleb Holt? He'll come for you too. I won't be the reason you die." Something hot flared in Caleb's chest, anger, but not at her. Anger at a world that let men like Donovan Vale claim women as property. He dropped the hammer, wiping his hands on his shirt. "I buried enough people I loved," he said, voice low. "I won't stand by and let another be dragged off to hell. You're here now. That makes this your home. And a man defends his home." For a moment, Seraphina only stared at him, as if she couldn't believe his words. Then her face softened, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, as the prairie lay under a silver moon, Caleb heard it, faint but unmistakable. Hoofbeats, not the scattered rhythm of strays, organized, steady, a group. He slipped from his bed, rifle in hand, and stepped to the window. Out on the horizon, tiny silhouettes crested a ridge. A half-dozen riders, torches flickering in the dark, Donovan Vale had arrived. The confrontation. The riders stopped at the gate just as dawn broke. Caleb stood on the porch, rifle slung over his shoulder, every muscle taut. Beside him, Seraphina hovered in the shadows, her breath sharp and shallow. The man at the front dismounted with slow, deliberate grace. Tall, dressed in a black frock coat despite the dust, with a polished cane he didn't seem to need. His hat shaded his face until he stepped closer. Donovan Vale. Handsome in a cruel way, his smile never reaching the cold steel of his eyes. "Mr. Holt," he said, voice smooth as oil. "I believe you've got something that belongs to me." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Don't see your brand on anything here." Donovan chuckled, twirling his cane. "You've a sharp tongue for a man who lives alone. But let's speak plain. The woman, she's my wife. The law says so. And I've come to claim her." Seraphina's voice broke from behind Caleb. "I'm not your wife, Donovan." "I never was." The words cracked the morning like a rifle shot. Donovan's smile froze. Slowly, he turned his head, fixing her with a gaze that made her shrink back. "You'll regret saying that," he said softly. Then to Caleb, "Step aside, rancher. You've no stake in this." Caleb raised his rifle, resting it across his forearm. "She asked for my protection. That's stake enough." For a long moment, silence hung heavy. The riders shifted in their saddles, the horses snorting, the prairie wind tugging at their coats. Finally, Donovan's smile returned, sharper now. "Very well, Holt, if it's a fight you want." He tipped his hat. "We'll let the prairie decide." He mounted his horse and wheeled it around, his men following. They rode off, dust rising behind them like smoke. But Caleb knew it wasn't retreat. It was promise. Aftermath back inside, Seraphina gripped his arm. "You shouldn't have done that. He won't stop. He'll come back, Caleb. With more men, with more guns." Caleb looked at her, seeing both the fear and the fierce determination in her emerald eyes. "Then we'll be ready, you and me." Her lips parted, as if to argue, but instead she let out a trembling breath and nodded. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and quiet, but the silence was deceptive. Somewhere beyond those hills, Donovan Vale was plotting his return, and Caleb Holt, once a man who wanted only solitude, now stood at the edge of a war he never asked for, but could no longer turn away from. The days that followed were heavy with waiting. Caleb kept his rifle within reach at all times, patching weak spots in the corral fence, stacking firewood near the door as if preparing for a winter that wasn't yet here. Seraphina moved with a quiet urgency, cooking, sewing, storing water. Yet in her eyes, Caleb saw it, the storm of fear. Late one afternoon, Caleb saddled his mare. "I'll ride into Silver Bend. Need to know if the sheriff's still standing behind me." Seraphina touched his arm. You can't trust him. Donovan's money buys many men. Caleb gave a grim smile. Then I'll know for sure. Silver Bend, the town buzzed uneasily. Word had spread. Donovan Vale was back and he wanted blood. Caleb found Sheriff Asa Briggs outside the saloon, boots propped on the rail. The lawman's mustache twitched as Caleb approached. You stirring trouble, Holt, Asa muttered, not looking him in the eye. Vale's got papers. Marriage license, witnesses. If he presses, the law's on his side. Caleb's voice was low and hard. And what about Wright? You know what kind of man he is. Asa finally looked at him, weary, beaten. Wright don't hold up in court when gold tips the scales. The words hit Caleb like a hammer, alone. That's what it came to. He mounted and rode out without another word, the weight of the town's silence pressing harder than Donovan's threats. The siege began at dusk. The horizon glowed red as if the sun itself bled into the earth. Seraphina stood by the window, shawl clutched tight, when she saw them, dark shapes moving across the ridge, more than before. 10, maybe 12 riders. Caleb, she whispered. He was already at the door, rifle loaded. His heart pounded steady, but his face was stone. The riders fanned out, circling the cabin like wolves. Donovan dismounted, his black coat fluttering in the wind, cane tapping against the dry earth. Last chance, Holt, he called, his voice carried clear. Step aside and hand her over. No need to die for a woman who ain't yours. Inside, Seraphina pressed her back against the wall, eyes wide. Caleb glanced at her, then back through the slit of the shutter. She's mine, he called back. By choice, not chains. A laugh, sharp as a whip crack. Donovan lifted his hand. His men dismounted, rifles raised. The first shot shattered the stillness. Fire and fury glass splintered, wood splintered. Caleb fired through the window, one rider dropping into the dust. Seraphina cried out but ducked low, grabbing a pistol from the table, the one Caleb had left for her. Smoke filled the cabin as bullets tore through the walls. Caleb reloaded fast, his muscles remembering years of hunting, of war. 2 more men fell, their shouts swallowed by the storm of gunfire. Then silence. Caleb's breath came heavy, ears ringing. He peered out. The riders had pulled back, regrouping near the fence line. Donovan stood tall among them, untouched, his smile cutting through the smoke. This ends tonight, Donovan shouted. When the fire burns down, Holt, you'll have nothing left but ash. Caleb's stomach dropped as he saw 2 men ride forward with torches. The flames bright against the dusk. They'll burn us out, Seraphina gasped. Caleb's jaw set. Not if we break first. The charge before Seraphina could protest, Caleb threw open the door. The suddenness caught Donovan's men off guard. Caleb fired once, twice, dropping a torchbearer. The second reeled back, flames scattering in the dust. Inside! Caleb barked. Seraphina stepped to the threshold, pistol steady despite her trembling hands. She fired. The shot wild, but enough to scatter the closest rider. Donovan's cane struck the ground. Take him. The rider surged forward. Caleb ducked behind the corral post, rifle cracking again and again. Horses screamed, men shouted, dust rose in thick clouds. Seraphina reloaded clumsily, covering him, her emerald eyes blazing with something fiercer than fear. At last, as the smoke cleared, the remaining riders pulled back. Only 4 left standing. The rest lay scattered on the prairie. Donovan stood at the center, untouched. His smile was gone now, replaced by cold fury. This isn't finished, Holt, he snarled. I'll be back. And when I come, you'll beg me to take her. With a sharp pull of the reins, he wheeled his horse and rode off, his men limping after him into the night. Aftermath. The prairie went quiet again, broken only by the ragged sound of breathing. Caleb lowered his rifle, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Seraphina stepped beside him, hand trembling as it touched his arm. You stood for me, she whispered. Caleb looked at her, not just the beauty that had stunned him days before, but the courage burning in her now. We stood, he corrected. For the first time in years, he felt it. Not just survival, but purpose. But as he looked toward the dark horizon, he knew Donovan Vale wasn't done. The final reckoning still waited. For 3 days after the siege, the prairie held its breath. Caleb patched the cabin walls with planks, buried the fallen horses in the gully, and kept his rifle within reach even as he slept. Seraphina moved quietly, but never far from him, her presence a reminder of why he fought. On the 4th evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Caleb saddled his mare. "You can't go," Seraphina said, her voice sharp with fear. "If you ride after him, he'll ride back here sooner or later," Caleb cut in. His voice was calm, steady, but his eyes carried steel. "I won't let him choose the time or place. This ends tonight." Her hand caught his arm, trembling. "And if you don't come back?" Caleb turned, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Then you'll know I didn't die running. I died standing." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then Seraphina pressed something into his hand, the small silver cross she wore on a chain around her neck. "Bring it back to me," she whispered. Silver Bend Saloon. The saloon in Silver Bend was alive with noise when Caleb pushed through its doors. Poker tables, smoke, and laughter filled the air, but it all quieted when Donovan Vale rose from his chair. "Well, if it isn't the rancher," Donovan drawled, cane tapping against the floorboards. "Come to settle accounts?" Caleb's voice was gravel. One way or another, the room emptied fast. Men pushed back their chairs, slipping toward the walls. Even the piano man closed the lid. Everyone knew what was coming. Donovan smiled, twirling his cane. "You could have had peace, Holt, a quiet life. But you chose to bleed for a woman who isn't yours." "She chose me," Caleb shot back. "That's something you'll never understand." The duel, they stepped out into the street. The town gathered on the boardwalks, whispers rising like wind through grass. The setting sun painted the sky in fire as Caleb and Donovan faced each other. Caleb, rifle slung at his side. Donovan, hand resting on the polished handle of his revolver. "Last chance," Donovan sneered. "Step aside and maybe I'll let you walk away." Caleb's answer was silence. His boots dug into the dust, his eyes locked steady. The sheriff raised his hand. "On the count? 1, 2. Donovan moved early. His gun flashed before the word 3 left Ace's lips. But Caleb was ready. He dropped to one knee, rifle cracking with thunder. Donovan staggered, blood blooming across his coat. Yet with a snarl, he raised his revolver again. The second shot echoed, Caleb's bullet striking true. Donovan Vale fell backward into the dust, cane clattering beside him. The street went silent, save for the ringing in Caleb's ears. Aftermath. The sheriff knelt beside Donovan, shaking his head. "He's gone." Then he looked at Caleb, eyes heavy. "You'll answer for it. But most here'll call it justice." Caleb said nothing. He only turned and began walking, the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders. At the edge of town, Seraphina appeared, breathless, shawl whipping in the wind. She had followed, unable to wait. Her eyes found him, wide with fear until she saw the truth. He was still standing. She ran to him, her hands gripping his face. "You came back." Caleb pressed the silver cross into her palm. "Told you I would." Tears welled in her emerald eyes as she leaned into him. Around them, the townsfolk whispered, watching the rancher who had faced down Donovan Vale not for land, not for pride, but for love. Epilogue. Weeks later, the prairie was green with spring. The cabin stood sturdier than ever, its scars patched, its hearth warm. Caleb sat on the porch, whittling wood as the sun dipped low. Beside him, Seraphina laid a hand on his arm. "Do you ever wish you hadn't sent for a bride?" she asked softly. Caleb turned, his eyes tracing her face. The beauty, the strength, the fire that had carried them both through storm and blood. "No," he said simply. "I didn't get the bride I expected. I got the one I needed." Seraphina's lips curved into a smile, her fingers lacing with his. Together, they watched the horizon, no longer waiting for hoofbeats in the night, only the promise of tomorrow. And for the first time in years, Caleb Holt was not alone.